everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. We're back in Harrisburg. We're here in the beautiful collectibles building of the Midtown Scholar. And I want to thank you for making last week's Buy Day our most watched ever in the first week of airing. We had, as of yesterday, Olivia, you want to guess how many views?
2,000.
Over 3,000. Yeah, and that was pretty exciting. So I guess people really enjoy house cleanouts, especially in beautiful old houses down in Virginia. But this week we are going to talk about one of the leading lights of the Harlem Renaissance, Zora Neale Hurston, a marvelous writer. Why? Well, because just before I left for vacation, just before I went off to New Orleans, a book came into the sort room that was so special. It actually inspired part of our trip, and that is Zora Neale Hurston's second book called Mules and Men, in which, among other places, she journeys to New Orleans to discuss the hoodoo culture. This is a first edition of Mules and Men, and this is the edition that you'll see in the video, because this is the one that we took, both Cathy and I read on our trip to New Orleans. So let's begin our discussion of Mules and Men with a little video we made in New Orleans of the very house where Zora Neale Hurston stayed and learned the arts of hoodoo. It was this house that Zora Neale Hurston wrote Langston Hughes about during her anthropological time in 1928-29 in New Orleans, when she came to learn the mysteries of hoodoo culture. We are talking about Mules and Men today. We brought a copy and we've been reading it on our trip. It's an absolutely fascinating story, but basically Hurston, who is an anthropologist by trade, was studying with one of the great anthropologists of really considered the father of modern anthropology. That's Franz Boas, who wrote the introduction for this book. And he was also the teacher of Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and all sorts of famous anthropologists. Hurston believed in what Boas believed, which was that we needed to have, just as Plessy believed in sort of colorblind justice, we need to have anthropology which was not cloaked in scientific racism. At any rate, she studied hoodoo culture here in New Orleans, and among other things, learned to do spells and kill sheep and chickens and put curses. Really a remarkable thing. If you pan behind me, Cathy, you can see we've got a chicken right there in the window of the building across the street. But anyhow, back to Hurston. I know that you found the book a little disturbing, didn't you? What did you?
There was a lot of gore.
A lot of gore, yes. I mean, there are actual
spells.
There were
many serious curses that were very dark.
But it was in this house where she was studying with the person who claimed to be the nephew or the great nephew of Marie Laveau. We saw Marie Laveau's tomb in the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. I'll show you a photo of that now. And even today, people will leave offerings and put X marks on the tomb in an effort to make prayers or to have wishes granted. But it was here that for several days, I think it was over 69 hours, she lay naked on a couch without any food or water, and had psychedelic experiences. I don't think she drank it, but she had access to water. And she was initiated into the voodoo rites. And she writes about all this in what could be considered some of the first gonzo journalism. But we wanted to bring you here so you could see the site. And now let's go back to Harrisburg. Okay, well, we're back now here in studio. I hope you enjoyed that video, and we're going to talk specifically about the book. If you look at it, Olivia, isn't it a great dust jacket? Mm-hmm. Very hard to find this dust jacket so well preserved. But if we flip it open, here's the foreword that I mentioned in the video by Franz Boas. I can't exaggerate enough how important Franz Boas was to getting this book published. He's considered the father of American anthropology, and by putting his imprimatur on this book, he really put Hurston on the map. When you look at the table of contents, you'll see it's divided into two parts. The first part is folk tales, and the second part is hoodoo. Hoodoo is what we talked about in New Orleans, but there's also these great recordings of folk tales. Now, Hurston went to Columbia to study under Boas and then traveled the world collecting these stories. And the stories are much like sort of Aesop's fables or other types of stories. Olivia, they answer questions that maybe you didn't know needed answering, like why the waves have white caps, or why the mockingbird is away on Fridays, and all sorts of just interesting questions. I want to talk about one because it is a really interesting story, and that is how the church came to be split up. It talks about basically the African American church, and I'm going to tell you the story in a second. But one thing you need to know about Hurston was that this book, her previous book, and even her famous book, Her Eyes Were Watching God, all were not particularly well received during her lifetime, and she sort of disappeared into obscurity until being rediscovered in 1975 by the author of The Color Purple, Alice Walker. And Alice Walker, of all places, decided to write a story about looking for Hurston and trying to discover her unmarked grave in Ms. Magazine back in 1975. And this is the story that started it all. It was a really interesting story. She basically said she was the heir of Hurston, and she actually put a marker on Hurston's unmarked grave. And it was Alice Walker that then saw to it that all of Hurston's works got put sort of back in the canon and basically republished. She was controversial in her own time because, unlike, say, Richard Wright, Hurston did not want to take an overt political stance in her writing. She wanted to portray things the way they were. It was part of her sort of commitment to the cultural relativism that Boas preached and others preached, which is that we're going to accept culture for what it is. We're not going to judge it by our own standards. And she was a very serious anthropologist, and this wasn't enough for people like Langston Hughes or Richard Wright, who wanted her to condemn racism in the South more than she did. She does her own part to set the story straight, that's for sure, but it isn't overt like, say, Native Son. But anyhow, let me tell you this folk tale about how the church came to be split up. So the story goes, according to Hurston, who overhears this on a porch somewhere in the deep South, that Jesus goes on a walk with his apostles, and he tells each of his apostles to bring a rock with them. They don't know why, but they bring a rock. They walk for several hours. They get tired. They keep having to shift the rock from hand to hand. It's very heavy. And eventually, after the walk, he sits down and he turns the rocks into bread, and they all get to eat. Except for Peter, who decided he'd be really clever, and he just brought a little pebble, so it would be less to carry on the walk, so he only got a tiny little piece of bread. Well, Jesus tells them a few days later they're going on another walk and grab a rock, and so this time Peter, trying to be really clever, gets the biggest rock he can carry. It's such a gigantic rock. And let Alice Walker read from Zora Neale Hurston and tell you the rest of the story.
Way long in the evening, Christ went up under a great big old tree and sat down and called all of his disciples around him and said, "Now everybody bring up your rocks." So everybody brought theirs, but Peter was about a mile down the road, punching that half a mountain he was bringing. So Christ waited till he got there. He looked at the rocks that the other 11 disciples had, and then he seen this great big mountain that Peter had. And so he got up and walked over to it and put one foot up on it and said, "Why, Peter, this is a fine rock. This is a noble rock. And Peter, on this rock, I'm going to build my church." And Peter says, "No, you ain't neither." You won't build no church house on this rock. You're going to turn this rock into bread. And Christ knew that Peter meant that thing, so he turned the hillside into bread. And that mountain is the bread he fed the 5,000 with. Then he took them 11 other rocks and glued them together and built his church on that. And that's how come the Christian churches is split up into so many different kinds.
So that gives you a flavor, I think, Olivia, of what the book is like. It's written in that type of dialect. It's a wonderful book. It's inspiring and really interesting. But you know what's special about our copy? our copy was at one point signed and inscribed by Hurston herself. And if you look at the front end paper, you'll see that sadly somebody has clipped the signature, but this is Hurston's hand, and it basically is written to somebody named Ralph D. Hartman, who plays lead trumpet in the same band with Gabriel. What's interesting is Hartman was apparently a book collector. He lived in Cleveland, and he had other people from the Harlem Renaissance also send him copies inscribed of his books. And you can find currently online a copy of Richard Wright's Native Son, also inscribed and sent to Hartman. So it must have been an amazing library at one point. Now, why anyone would clip the signature, I don't know, but I'll show you two things. One, to show you that it's her writing. Let me show you an example of an inscription that she wrote in her first book. This is definitely the same concept, the same writing. And another interesting fact I was able to find in another auction catalog, the very wrapper that this book was sent in to Hartman himself. Can you zoom in on that? Because I think that's really cool. This is simply somebody selling the package for $500 that was hand addressed by her Hurston to Hartman, which I think is an interesting thing. So clearly when Hartman died, his estate was scattered to the wind and all these great books were split up, and maybe somebody framed the signature. Remember, if this was cut prior to the Alice Walker article in 1975, people didn't really value Hurston that much, so the book was not worth very much. But today, it's worth quite a lot, even though it's in the state that it's in. I guess the question is, how much does a clip signature affect the book? I'm not really sure. We'll think about that. You can leave me some comments on your own. I know we would never do this, Olivia, to a book, but it's still Hurston's copy. It's still inscribed in her handwriting. It still has the wonderful original Dutch jacket. Okay, we're going to end with a funny book. I've been dying to get back into the studio to get back to my stack of funny books, and this one came in, and it just seemed so right. So right for Mules and Men. Yes, Olivia, it's A Passion for Donkeys. And it's everything you've ever wanted to know about donkeys. And we're not going to call them mules. We're going to call them donkeys. Did you know, for instance, and this is true, that Queen Victoria actually had a carriage that was pulled by donkey? Mm-hmm. I bet you didn't know that. But I learned that in A Passion for Donkeys. I learned so many other things, and you can too if you come to the Midtown Scholar and purchase your copy of A Passion for Donkeys. Well, it feels good to be back here in Harrisburg, back in the studio, on the hunt for more amazing things. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll watch next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books.